Welcome, everybody. My name is Gabe Scheinman. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's nice to see so many people and students, alumni, and others join. It's my really great pleasure to be joined by it. And I don't know what the ranking of the appropriate honorific is. I don't know if Dean ranks above Professor, ranks above Doctor, but Dean Eliot Cohen, who as of about a year ago is the Dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Where he's been a member of the faculty for almost 3 decades. And prior to his becoming dean, he was also the founder and director of the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies. I know many of you are SAIS alum or might be considering it, and I highly recommend it. And previous to that, he'd also served for 2 years at the very end of the George W. Bush administration as counselor to the Department of State. He's the author of way too many books to list on military history and strategic studies, but most recently, The Big Stick, The Power, and the Necessity of Military Force, published in 2017. Prolific writer, avid Twitter man, and mostly, I'd say these days, probably mostly can be found at The Atlantic. And then most importantly, I would say from my perspective, he's also a member of the AHS Board of Advisors. And so it's a real pleasure to welcome Eliot here today.
It's great to be with you, Gabe. I wish we were in person, but this is not a bad second best.
Not a bad, right. So as I was saying to Eliot, we titled this event Conversation with Dean Cohen about the American role in the world, but it's really much more a conversation about the American role in the world. You know, I'm sure every day you could attend or read something that says we are at an inflection point and they're shifting stands and the traditional North Stars are no longer where you think they are. Fair enough, you probably hear this a lot. But I do think at this moment, compared to 10 years ago or 10 years before that, we are at a little bit of a different place. The threats are rising in complexity and in multitude. A lot of the, I think, core assumptions or our understandings of whether it's China or Russia, Iran in a lot of the 1990s and even 2000s seem quite antiquated. It seems like the pace or the acceleration, I think, about how we talk about these issues and what we view as the proper American role in the world has accelerated. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity with someone who both as a historian, as a practitioner, and also as a leader of an academic institution that really tries and education trains students in these regards, has about these things. So why don't we jump right in? And just one public service announcement before that. We will definitely set aside a lot of time for questions and answer. You can feel free at any time to submit them in the Q&A function, and I'll keep track of them and then be able to read them out loud when the time comes. So Eliot, the American role in the world as we know it is still to some degree a shadow or a legacy of the result of our involvement in World War II and the number of critical decisions that we made in the early days of the Cold War. Today, when you look at this time of particular discord or debate, we seem to look fondly back on those formative years, those immediate years after World War II, and even for much of the Cold War period as a time of great consensus in how Americans kind of viewed American foreign policy, whether it's between left and right, east and west, elites and popular approach, et cetera. Can you place for us today's debate and today's discord in that larger context, in that historical context? Is our discussion today fundamentally different than where we were, let's say, even 60 or 70 years ago?
Well, I think it is different, Gabe, but I wouldn't, I think it'd be a big mistake to think that there was some sort of halcyon era of accord about American foreign policy. You know, from the very outset, at the end of World War II, you have the question, okay, are we going to remain engaged in European affairs? There was a huge fight for the soul of the Republican Party when Dwight D. Eisenhower beat Robert Taft. And in fact, I think one of the lessons I've taken away from that is that the Taftian instinct in the Republican Party went underground, but it never really went away in the way that I think many people, including myself, thought that it had. You know, there was terrible aftertaste from Korea, Vietnam. I mean, that's when I was in my early teens, and Vietnam ripped this country apart. Even after Vietnam, when I was in a position that a lot of AHS members are now in graduate school and just getting beyond graduate school. There were, you know, the debates may seem somewhat obscure about intermediate nuclear forces and the strategic arms limitation, but the overarching question was détente, and you try to negotiate a long-term relationship with the Russians, or do you assume it's hostile? What's the weight of human rights in the conduct of American foreign policy? That was, you know, really vociferously debated, and people were on different sides of that one. Star Wars, you can go on. So I think that the first thing everybody should kind of breathe a little bit more deeply and to say American foreign policy has always been contested and always will be, because, you know, we are simply doomed to play a very large role in the world, whether we wish to or not. And the choices will never be entirely clear, and there'll be large chunks of American opinion that they're really unhappy with it. I do think we're in a different situation now. The reason why we're in a different situation now is actually a couple of reasons. One is, again, just external objective circumstances. The arrival of China, I try to avoid using the word the rise of China. The arrival of China as a country that is, in aggregate, has wealth comparable to the United States, GDP comparable to the United States, and that seems to be a growing economy, and that wishes to exert its power in ways which are partly material, partly ideological. That's a fundamental change. The second big change is within the United States. This administration is the first administration which, you know, it's not so much that it has isolationist instincts, but it has, you know, the instincts that are captured in that slogan, America First. And we've never had a president so assertive in that way in terms of talking about about America's role in the world. Now, that said, you know, it turns out that the institutions and the external reality have prevented him from getting everything he wants. But and here's I'll just sort of stop with a somewhat more provocative point. In some respects, I wouldn't call him Obama with bad manners, but there are certain ways in which Trump's approach to foreign policy has some echoes of the Obama approach. You know, nation building at home. Well, American carnage is a much worse way of putting it, but the concept is the same, that there's a lot of repair work that needs to be done at home, and this external stuff is kind of a distraction. Similar attitudes actually towards Iraq and Afghanistan. Similar desire not to take the lead in foreign institutions. I mean, it's leading from behind. That's not a phrase Trump would use, but the idea isn't all that dissimilar. A kind of disdain for NATO as a bunch of freeloaders. You know, you couldn't get more harsh than Bob Gates was when he was Obama's Secretary of Defense. You can go on. Now, there are huge differences between the two, obviously. But the point is that there's a stream of thought which has been both out there on the left and in a much more ragged and edged way on the right, which have come together and are a significant force in a way that they haven't been for a while, I believe.
So let me we'll get to this moment in a second, but why didn't some of the seemingly catalytic events of the past, like why weren't they actually catalytic? So why didn't we have this debate triggered by the end of the Cold War, for example? It seems like a big change. Or why even 9/11, which you'd figure another kind of inflection point. It seems like things are happening now without any obvious, let's say, a push off a cliff, whereas we have these events in the past.
I think the end of the Cold War did not trigger the debate because there was no external pressure to do so. Hegemony was cheap. I do think historians will look back on the first Gulf War and they'll think a lot about it, and they'll think about it differently than contemporaries did. At the time, it just seemed like a marvel and extraordinary, very low casualties for the United States, other, huge coalition. Well, Yeah, but there were two aspects of it. One was the fact that other countries paid for that war, and in fact, we made a small profit, and that our casualties were extremely light, made the burdens of international predominance look really light. And then the second thing is, and this is a little bit darker, and a lot of people would push back on it, but I still believe it. Because of the way the war ended, we set ourselves up for a generation more of involvement in the affairs of that part of the Middle East. We left ourselves with Saddam Hussein still in charge in Baghdad, which in turn set off a whole set of follow-on events that got us more deeply in, and then in turn kind of affected American foreign policy more broadly. But what I would say in that case, fundamentally, in the early 90s, predominance was cheap. You could reduce defense budgets and still be predominant. So why have a debate that you don't need to have? 9/11 was different in that it was an attack, it was a blow. There was nothing in it though to make you rethink your role in the world. I mean, Pearl Harbor changes your view of what the United States needs to do in the world. In order to make ourselves safe, we really have to be out there as a military power pretty much everywhere. 9/11, what it leads to is saying we got to get these guys who are coming to get us. And again, we had the resources to do it. And so we did it. So there was no forcing function. I don't think you get debates unless there's something that's forcing you to have that, because let's face it, debates mean surfacing difficult choices and unpleasant facts, and who wants to do that?
So I want to pick up on something you said just there in terms of the Gulf War and some of the events that happened afterwards, which is, on the one hand, you said the United States hegemony was cheap, and the period of the post-Cold War moment, what Charles Krauthammer called the unipolar moment, hegemony was cheap, and there are many who have accused the United States of being hegemonic and having those ambitions. On the other hand, from what you just said, and tell me if I'm putting the wrong words in your mouth or correct me, which is you said in some ways our restraint at the end of the Gulf War in particular, although maybe there are other instances in the lead up to that, is actually what maybe caused longer or deeper or prevented us from trying to address some of the more sustained issues that caused problems a little later on. Am I understanding that argument correctly? Because it seems to push against the grain on some of the critique.
On Iraq, I would say at the time I thought it was the right decision not to go to Baghdad and finish Saddam Hussein off. In retrospect, I think it was a mistake. But that's because I knew afterwards things that I didn't know at the time, and that often happens. I think, innately there was going to be resentment and hostility towards the United States, no matter what, just because nobody really likes the most powerful country on earth. Very few people are going to say, isn't it great we have such a benign hegemon? I think, there's this debate about NATO expansion. Was it wise? Wasn't it wise? And I guess my feeling about that one is that it was perfectly reasonable to extend NATO to the East European countries, but probably not to go any further. So I think it was a mistake to even kind of toy with Ukraine or Georgia. But the second thing is, I am not sure that we could have created a Russia that would be kind of benignly content with the status quo. Having, great countries that lose empires get into a funk. And in the case of Russia, it wasn't just losing its East European empire, it was losing its very identity as the Soviet Union and all the humiliation that went through it. And I don't think there was any way we could have gotten them past the humiliation. I just think some kind of nationalistic resurgence was likely. And to be fair to the Clinton administration and indeed to the early Obama administration too, and for that matter, the Bush administration, they all did their best to extend some kind of hand to Russia. it just, the circumstances and the realities were what the realities were.
And so if that's the case, and, again, 9/11 is another maybe inflection point to discuss. Looking back, you just kind of reassessed a little bit the 90s, looking back almost 2 decades now after 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, and the Iraq war, which in my view are in some ways 3 separate conflicts, or at least that's the way we conceive them. How would you grade our efforts? There's a critique within the Trump administration in general that you said similar to the Obama years, right? That's there. But there's also a critique amongst people who would otherwise consider themselves hawks, conservatives, maybe realists in the traditional vein of things, who say, well, as you say, the arrival or the rise of China is where the game is at, and this has actually been a distraction. And we need to make tough choices. So how would you assess these last 2 decades of what has functionally been the prime thrust of our foreign policy efforts?
Well, first there are similar critiques, of course, of Vietnam. And I guess my feeling about that is, yeah, I mean, in retrospect, you stand back and look at it, and what is it that we have to show for our efforts? On the other hand, and this is the point I think that makes these discussions very, very difficult for people to have in a way that's fair, is you have to say, well, what do you think, what would the world have looked like without the Iraq War, with a Saddam Hussein who, was planning on getting nuclear weapons and did have biological weapons? What would a world look like with Iraq getting out from under sanctions and inspections, or conversely in Iraq where you were continuing to have an enormous amount of suffering as a result of those sanctions? Do you mean, or take Afghanistan, you mean we weren't supposed to go into Afghanistan? Well, what would the world look like if you hadn't overthrown the Taliban regime? Well, you say we should have left right away. Well, first, what are you humanly responsible for if you do that? And what kind of world do you think you'd be in then? So I think these are all intrinsically much more difficult decisions than they look in retrospect. And it's, people don't, to come to a fair judgment, you have to try to walk in the shoes of the decision makers who are, find themselves having to make a call that that their critics never really have to make. I think the other issue, though, which is for me in some ways a more troubling one, has to do with the competence of the institutions. So, for example, I'll take the Iraq War, which I was in favor of, but which I also felt and still feel was in many ways badly mismanaged. Our institutions were not nearly as adaptable as we would have wanted them to be to the challenges of, say, counterinsurgency in Iraq, or really thinking through in a serious way, what do you do with the successor regime in Afghanistan? And that's actually something that I think that's the argument which I think would be more fruitful to have. You can go back and forth on should we have invaded Iraq or not invaded Iraq, and will make some people feel very virtuous to say we shouldn't have, and others to be can be very defensive and say we should have. But I think the more interesting conversation to be had is, well, why did our institutions perform the way they did? Is there any reason to think that they are any better now than they were before? And what are some of the other areas where our institutions may not be up to what's required of them? And, those are questions which I think we can ask in a number of areas. We can look, we're living through a pandemic that's a lot worse than what, say, a Germany or Japan is going through. You can blame the American people for that, I suppose, but it should cause us to ask, well, what kind of public health system do we have? And is it able to deal with what it needs to deal with? So I think there's an analogous conversation to be had about foreign policy.
So to stay on the question of, let's say, kind of institutions and capabilities, a lot of people track that with in some ways you could track it with whether people think the American government or American society is on the rise or on the decline, let's say. And this concept of American decline was very much, I feel like it's disappeared a little bit, and that's kind of the question I want to ask. But a decade ago, that question, that debate was very much at the fore. It wasn't exactly a left-right thing, but I think brought about a little bit by the troubles in Iraq and then the Great Recession, the financial crisis. But you sort of had on the center left the kind of Fareed Zakaria view, the post-American world, where American decline was inevitable and the United States need to embrace it and welcome it in a bunch of different ways. And then on the right, the sort of I think it was an essay in National Review epitomized by Charles Krauthammer about decline as a choice. And there was nothing inevitable about where this was going. And it was a lot of if we rededicate ourselves to a variety of things, it would change things. So given where we are today, do you feel like that question, and again, the institutions is a core part of that, do you think that question is still apt? Do you think it's been solved? Do you think the United States has peaked in terms of its role in the world? Or do you think that we still maintain quite a lot of agency in terms of how the future is written?
So my view of that debate is very much colored by having been exposed to one of the great minds of the late 20th century, Raymond Aron, who in 1973, who was a great friend of the United States, who was a French liberal in the old-fashioned sense of the word, dedicated anti-communist, a commentator, a scholar. And he wrote a book called The Imperial Republic in 1973, which basically said the United States is all pretty much washed up. And the era of the superpowers is over. The Russians are also, in a different way, pretty much washed up, but they've caught up with the Americans. And, we'll just have to we Europeans will have to find our way in a world in which the United States is incapable of leading, and it's no longer what it was. And whatever you think of where the world is now, that was not a very good prediction for what the 1980s and 1990s were going to look like. So, what I would say is predictions of American decline have been around really since the beginning. I mean, starting with people thinking that, constitutional government wouldn't last, or people should track down, there's a great column in The Economist at the beginning of the Civil War by Walter Bagehot, one of the most brilliant political commentators the English-speaking world has ever produced, saying, well, this just proves that the United States was founded on a vicious principle, I think is the phrase he uses, and of course it's going to fall apart. I mean, that was inevitable and predictable. We get these things lots and lots of times. I guess my feeling, I'm closer to Krauthammer. So in other words, I think ultimately this is an incredibly dynamic society, and it's, just kind of slam bang one thing after another. And there's good and there's bad, and it's just always in a froth. But that basically its future is good. The way I would qualify that is, I do think that there's a real deterioration in our intellectual culture, and in some of the values of liberal norms of speech and behavior, and partly just of learning, that is different from what we've seen in the past. I mean, there's on both left and right, you get what's called cancel culture. You have somewhat fewer people being willing to kind of face down their own side in defense of principles. I think it's a less well-read. Our leadership is less well-read and less thoughtful than once it was. But at the end of the day, do I think any of that's mortal? Not necessarily. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, I come down on the side of agency. We get, it's up to us to choose. I'll say one other thing, which is to the extent that there's relative decline, just in terms of the equilibrium of international politics, I think that's all about the arrival of China, some modest recovery of Russia, and kind of the general effervescence of Asia, at least until COVID.
So I don't want to insult academics by calling them intellectuals, but while we kind of stay on that topic,
actually, can I just stop you right there? That's one of the problems. I mean, one of the problems is one of the things that is different from the Cold War is you had an intellectual class, which included a lot of academics. But you had, the group around commentary, or the group around National Review, if you're looking on the conservative side, or on the left, it would have been Partisan Review and Moment and a whole bunch of other things. And now what you have is, I think you have fewer academics who are genuinely intellectuals. I think you have more who can think of themselves as rather narrow professionals, which is something different. In other words, not people who live for the world of ideas and who are critics in the best sense of the word, trying to sort of figure out how things happen the way they do. And a lot of the intellectual work has been displaced onto think tanks, which tend to be more shallow and more partisan and more short term. So there, I think there is a problem. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. You have people like my wonderful colleagues, Anne Applebaum and Yasha Monk, they are public intellectuals of the old school. But I think it's harder than it was once. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I wanted to kind of lead into that and talk a little bit also about your role as obviously an academic for your whole career, obviously, but also especially in recent years as leading both first a center and then ultimately an institution focused on these efforts. And a lot of what we do at AHS, a lot of the reasons we exist actually is frankly that a lot of what students are being taught or what the kind of opinions or worldviews that are exposed to them are being self-censored or shut down in a lot of campuses, academic cultures. And so I was curious for your take, and SAIS is obviously a little unique is improper grammar, but somewhat unique, let's say, in that sense. But just from your career and colleagues at other institutions, do you feel that academics, do you feel like professors understand seriously some of the challenges that this country faces externally and what American foreign policy could look like or ought to look like, and want to pass that along to their students, even if they disagree with some policy prescriptions? Do you feel that there's been a change, kind of what you tracked, but a change in that over the years? I, as an organization, obviously focused on so many students, young people, the crises of today are obviously concerning, but we're trying to build the intellectual capital to deal with where we're going to be in 20 years. But you can't necessarily do that if you don't have the teachers who are committed to seeing what the world looks like and not what they wish it to look like.
Well, I love SAIS. I've spent 30 years here. I think it is unique. Look, we have things like the Kissinger Center with people like Frank Gavin and Hal Brands and Mary Serrati, who do very traditional kind of high, what you used to think of as sort of high foreign policy kinds of things. But then we also have wonderful faculty members like Jessica Fanzo, who does food security and has very few illusions about what it all entails. So I think one of the things that's precious about SAIS that for as long as I'm dean, I'll do my level best to maintain, is that sense of being grounded in the world as it is, and of doing research that is policy relevant, even when it's not directly pushing a policy. There is and we attract faculty who want that, but I think it's also fair to say that those faculty are not always coming from traditional political science departments, which have wandered further from the policy world. The other things that you touched on free speech, and one of the things I feel very fortunate about is we're a division of Johns Hopkins. The president of Johns Hopkins is a civil rights lawyer, and he takes issues of academic freedom very seriously. There's a famous Chicago statement, University of Chicago statement on academic freedom. For my money, the Hopkins statement is just as good. And on every occasion that I can, I make it clear that that's the hill of academic freedom is the one that I'm prepared to die on. And you don't get a whole lot of pushback. Now that may very well change. We're going through a period where there's a lot of passion, and a certain amount of unrest on the streets, and left to their own devices, I'm sure there'll be some who will push for things which would constrain people's ability to say the things that they think. But I think we will, as long as I'm in the job, we'll hold the line on that.
So last question on my end, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So there's a bunch of questions in the hopper, but please, everybody, feel free to keep filling it. So I don't think it's a secret. You're, as a vociferous critic of the president as they come, and have been, I think, from the beginning. And we're obviously going to see what happens in November. But whether it's in January 2021 or January 2025, what do you think about the Trump doctrine, if there is one, will stay with us beyond this presidency? What is it about? He seems to have made, in one way or another, psychological breakthrough, let's say, on how the American foreign policy lead at least views China. But is that something that's superficial, or is that something that's fundamental? It seems like through his response to Russia, he seems to have turned the Democratic Party into Russia hawks in a lot of different ways. So putting aside the president's demand, although that is obviously important in a lot of different ways, and we shouldn't discount it, what do you think actually will be lasting from his approach to American foreign policy?
So I don't think there's a Trump doctrine, because basically all the man has is an id. He doesn't have a doctrine, and there's nobody in the administration who is capable of articulating one. And you don't really have a doctrine unless you can spell out what it is and what it means and why you're doing it. I think that said, there are a number of the instincts that Trump has which will survive him, in part because they also preceded him. So let's take the changing relationship with China. That actually was beginning already under Obama. And I think it reflects, a kind of a deeper awareness on the part of American foreign policy elites, the American business community, the American NGO community, that, this is an authoritarian regime. It is not going to liberalize, just the reverse. It's capable of doing some pretty ugly things. Think about the Uyghurs, think about what we've just seen in Hong Kong. It is building its military up at a pretty extraordinary level. It's making territorial claims that we don't accept. So I think that change of course towards an adversarial relationship with China was underway before. He's just made it more edged. With Russia, I mean, it's odd because he's clearly at variance with the views of even his own kind of cowed and intimidated congressional party, let alone the rest of the defense and intellectual and intelligence establishments. The one, and I would expect that Biden administration or some other Democratic administration to reverse that one pretty quickly and pretty easily. But the truth is, as he sometimes complains, I mean, actually his administration has had to preside over a whole set of sanctions directed against Russia. And there too, I think some of this is structural. As long as you have the kind of regime that you have in Russia, it's not going to be a particularly close relationship. There is, in the long run, a certain logic that will bring the two countries together, namely balancing China. So that will be there. And I think, different administrations are going to work their way through that. On Iran, I mean, I was a critic of the original Iran deal. I never thought it was actually going to lead to anything, and I think I was right. I think that was also bound to be a somewhat adversarial relationship. You know, as I mentioned, the attitude towards NATO, there again, he's building on things that were already there. So I think this is the kind of the dirty little secret, that there's more continuity in Trump than we might think. And you know, it even goes to the places he ignores, like Africa and Latin America. Well, traditionally, that's what American secretaries of state usually do. They ignore Africa and Latin America. I mean, the Bush administration did more with Africa actually than most others, but you know, it's much more continuity than any of us would like to admit. And I'll just say one other thing, because I have been a very vociferous critic of Trump, and unfortunately been borne out. You know, the core of my critique, and that of other Republicans and former Republicans, which is what I now am, has been about character. And that reflects our belief that character matters enormously. And it also reflected a belief that in a crisis, he would fail, and fail in ways that were dangerous to the Republic. And there again, I mean, nobody anticipated a pandemic, but I think that is what we're seeing. So that's the nature of the critiques. It's not a particular doctrine per se.
All right, so let's get a question. So we have a large group, so I'm just going to read them out loud from here. So, and this is a question that's somewhat COVID related, as you just referenced. So, from Caroline Bryant, how do we build support for increased defense spending in light of steadily growing Chinese and Russian aggression in a post-COVID world with budget deficits, a slowed economy, a pressure to reinvest at home, and I'm sure just, you know, COVID specific, right? The amount of spending that's coming out of the Congress?
That's a great question to which I don't have a good answer. I think in general, the way you build a consensus for spending is by being very lucid about what other countries are doing. And I think most you know, people are now quite aware of Russian interference in our elections and so on. So I don't think it's that hard to build up consensus for spending on cyber defense. I think people don't know a whole lot about the evolution of the Chinese military, and they probably have only vague notions of what the Chinese are doing to try to assert control of the South China Sea. And that's, I think, basically what you have to do. You have to lay out the facts as they are. But I do think, you know, assuming it's a Biden administration, which I actually tend to assume is what we're going to be looking at, the pressure to really focus spending on domestic concerns is going to be enormous and completely understandable.
So this is a question from Samantha Stern, and it's a long one, so I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. But you know, to many of us, I think the election of President Trump came as a complete surprise. And although there were debates within the Republican Party about Republican foreign policy, it didn't seem like it was a central thrust. What we're seeing now in the Democratic Party, there seems to be quite a fight. And Samantha's question in particular is, you have a couple congressmen who are putting themselves up for chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee that have quite very different views about what American foreign policy should be, from Joaquin Castro and Gregory Meeks, more on the kind of progressive side, and Brad Sherman maybe on the more center-left side. To what extent do you think that these debates within the Democratic Party, especially if you're saying, even assuming perhaps even a Biden presidency, how do you think they're going to manifest themselves when it comes to actually putting into practice? Congress is an important player in these arena, but still a you know, tier 2 player in a variety of ways. So how do you view the domestic political currents on the left as they are shifting and manifesting themselves, whether in Congress in particular?
So I Maybe mistakenly, I take those a little bit less seriously than others might for a number of reasons. First, the question was about the House. Well, I mean, not only is this Congress a second-tier player, the House is a third-tier player. And the House Foreign Relations Committee really doesn't do anything. It's the Senate that has power, has chosen not to exert it. And Congress in general has been, I think, shamefully weak in the role that it should be playing in making American foreign policy. So, when was the last time Congress said, no, you can't just come to an agreement, it's going to be a treaty and the Senate has to vote on it. Secondly, while there'll be posturing on the left about foreign policy, at the end of the day, for the constituencies of all those representatives, they don't care about foreign policy. I mean, they're going to care about jobs. They're going to care about health insurance. They're going to care about policing. They're going to care about race relations. Foreign policy will be like number 15 on the list of things that they care about. It is true that you have a more vocal left wing of the Democratic Party than you had in the past. Although I'm not sure that it's that much more vocal than it was towards the end of Vietnam, when it was pretty darn vocal. I'm not sure it's a majority. It's certainly, I don't think it's really spilled into the Senate a whole lot. And in fact, if, as I think will happen, the Democrats really pick up a lot of seats in the House and the Senate, as well as the presidency, by definition, that means you're going to get a lot of representatives and senators from purple districts and states, and they'll exercise some sort of moderating effect. But final point I'd make is you look at the Biden team, it's all representatives of the swamp, or if you prefer, the blob, which I'm perfectly happy with. I'm just fine with having Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan and Anne-Marie Slaughter, those kinds of people there. They're not crazy. I don't agree with them about everything. They wouldn't expect me to. They're in favor of some policies that I would view as mistaken, but they are on the whole completely thoughtful, sensible, middle of the road kinds of people. And I think that, as is Biden himself on foreign policy things. So, my feeling is that you're going to have continuity. The big moment will come if you ever get somebody of the stature of a John McCain in the Senate, and I just don't see any on the horizon from either party, where you have somebody who could play the role that a Scoop Jackson played in an earlier era. That is, just this tremendous authority on foreign affairs, who has bipartisan respect, and who is a somewhat autonomous actor that the White House has to pay attention to.
So here's a term I actually haven't heard in a while, which is a question from John Radshoulders. Should the United States be concerned with winning over hearts and minds, or should we be content with knowing that we are making a positive difference in the lives of civilians in the countries to which our troops are deployed? Hearts and minds obviously being a core term, in many ways a strategic objective for it seems like much of the era of our wars in the Middle East, but something that we don't hear a lot anymore, both in that context or frankly even in the context when we discuss relations with China or Russia.
So I'd refer you to your friend Eliot Cohen, who did a dissertation on hearts and minds. Hearts and minds really describes a certain approach really to counterinsurgency, which says basically the counterinsurgent wins when they win over the hearts and minds of the population. There are other schools of counterinsurgency, including those that say hearts and minds matter less than being able to isolate populations from the insurgent and provide material incentives and so on. I think the larger point, though, that's embedded in that question is, should the United States care about what kind of society we are helping to shape simply by virtue of being there? And I think the answer has to be yes. And because you can't have, I mean, otherwise, you would say, well, if American troops are deployed somewhere where the local forces routinely, in the presence of American soldiers, get information by pulling people's fingernails out, you know, you just wouldn't pay attention to it. And that's not okay. You know, the fundamental challenge of American foreign policy is we have interests, and so we behave like a great power, like other great powers, now and throughout history. But we're also the country of the Declaration of Independence and Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan. And so we have some transcendent ideals. And we, when people look at us in the world, even when things are going badly, as they are now, they see a country that professes those ideals. And we can't escape them. The one really serious attempt to escape them, the Trump effort is an unserious attempt to escape them. The serious attempt was under Nixon, and it failed. And it failed because it just ran too much against the grain of what the United States is. So, you know, in that way, our ideals are going to be out there, and we have to reckon with them, you know, even if some people probably wish that we didn't have to.
Let me combine two questions that are similar to each other, one from Eliot Seckler and the other from Jade and Maziar's, which is basically about predicting the future. And I warn you, this is being recorded, and so you need to be careful. But whereas as some friends I know, I like to joke, I have hard enough time predicting the past, let alone the future. So what are the alternative paths forward? If you look 5 or 10 years down the road, and so much about projections is about bounding a certain amount of uncertainty, what are the different scenarios you could see playing out in terms of the American forward presence in the world, given choices either made by this administration or the next one? Will we, 10 years from now, for example, would we still be able to exercise freedom of navigation in the South China Sea? Would we still be able to even have a discussion about the defense of Taiwan? Would we still even care or react to or be in a position to Russian interventions along its own past empire? So I don't know, it's an open-ended question, but what are our realistic alternatives in front of us over the next 10 years is the way you see it?
Well, I guess the first thing I would say is, just to help structure one's thinking about the future, is if we look at our present, we're living through something which you all probably knew was intellectually at least was a possibility, namely a global pandemic that we seemed unable to really seriously cope with. But we never really kind of viscerally took it into account. I mean, most foreign policy experts say, yeah, I guess there could be a pandemic, but didn't pay any attention. And I think the lesson of that, and the lesson of the 2008 crash, and the lesson of 9/11, and the lesson of the first Gulf War, and the lesson of the fall of the Soviet Union, and a lot of other lessons are really big, unpredictable things happen. And they can really derange the trajectory of history. And so if you want to think about, I mean, the election of Donald Trump was a contingent event, and we'd be acting very differently in the world now if 70,000 voters in 3 states had gone in a different direction in 2016. So I think the first thing you have to do is you have to be extremely modest, and you have to, although you can think about structural kinds of things and trends, you also have to think about disjunctions and breaks. Breaks include things like pandemics. They include things like big wars. They include things like a war where somebody uses nuclear weapons. So I think all of those could dislodge us. I guess for me, the really interesting long-term, having said all that, setting it aside, I would go back to what's the long-term trajectory of China. With, on the one hand, its economic dynamism. On the other hand, with a regime whose legitimacy is based purely on rapid economic growth, which at some point it can no longer deliver, with a terrible demographic problem, with terrible environmental problems, with bad relations with all of its neighbors, with the possible exception of Russia. I think that's where I would begin asking lots of questions. I somehow tend to think that the American economy will come roaring back. I tend to think that the United States will get through its immediate crisis. We're going through, part of what's disrupting our domestic politics right now, Gabe, is that we are really at the cusp of the transition away from this country being predominantly composed of people who look like you and me to a much more diverse and honestly interesting mix of people. And I think people don't fully appreciate and acknowledge how difficult a change that is and how difficult a change it has to be. But I think we'll get through it, actually. And I think 20 or 30 years from now, we'll actually be able to congratulate ourselves on having gotten through it. And that makes us, in some ways, even more attractive. I mean, long run, I tend to think the United States is going to remain the most powerful country in the world, or the most important. It'll be more constrained than it was. But, at the end of the day, I still think we're going to end up with the best hand to play in international politics.
So I too think that our country would be a more attractive place if we have more people that have more heads of hair than you and I do. And we'll be able to have a much brighter future in that right as well. But on that point, Catherine Clark asked, how do our current domestic controversies, COVID, the economy, the cancel culture, questions of racial justice, it seems like we're in a cascade of a lot of controversies at the moment. But how do these current domestic controversies impact our international reputation? And as such, the kind of respect and influence we command in the world. And maybe I could add one addition to that, which is how much is our position in the world and how people react to us, frankly, just the question of our power versus a question of our reputation or our influence, let's say, at the same time?
Well, I think, the answer is it's both. If you have demonstrations in foreign cities about Black Lives Matter, it tells you two things. It tells you, first, that those countries probably have unresolved issues of their own that they find difficult to confront, which I think is quite often the case. And it also tells you that people are holding the United States to its ideals. And that actually indicates the power of American ideals, because otherwise they wouldn't care. Nobody demonstrates because Russia's not living up to Russian ideals, or China to Chinese ideals, or Iran to Iranian ideals, or for that matter, German to Germanic ideals. I mean, that it's about the United States. If it's about the United States, there's a reason for that. I do think the pandemic is doing, the combination of Trump and the pandemic is doing serious damage. Trump, just because he's not like Viktor Orban, who is a competent autocrat. He's an incompetent autocrat and kind of buffoonish. And the last thing you ever want is for people to be laughing at you. And I think there's an element of that there. And then the other thing is the pandemic. I mean, it is disgraceful that here we are. We're not in the second wave of this thing. We're in the first wave, and the numbers are going back up, including, in well-run states like the one that you and I live in. And and rocketing upwards in places like California or Arizona or Florida, which I believe, if it were an independent country, would have the fourth largest COVID load of any country in the world if Florida were an independent country. That, I think, does us a lot of damage. And because what that does is it tells you this is such an undisciplined society that it just can't do the very basic things that it needs to do in order to manage this pandemic. I mean, which is, let's face it, it's wearing masks and social distancing. That's, if you look at Japan, they got an old population, they're jammed in really tight, and they've had 1,000 deaths on a population base that's, what, a third or maybe a quarter of ours, and we have 132,000 dead. And the reason for that isn't because Japanese are intrinsically healthier. It's because they kind of followed the rules. And no, I have friends who insist that the way to think about this is that Americans are just freedom loving, and this is just part of the price you pay for that. I'm not so sure.
Every time there's a transition between two parties of the presidency, oftentimes the new occupant of the office seems to try and undo or delete or reverse a lot of the actions taken by So you saw it in the Bush administration. You saw it when Obama came to power as well. A number of the executive actions he took on the first day, in many ways, were meant to be rebukes or reversals. So this is a question from Joe Brennan. How do you think a hypothetical President Biden should deal with the legacy of Trump? Should he lean into things like increased tension with China, or should he try and backpedal, and should his goal to be attempt to return to some pre-Trump status quo?
So I think, first, what you say is absolutely true. I had one friend in the Bush administration who told me that her job, literally immediately after the inauguration, was to just stand by a fax machine and feed the fax machine with all kinds of orders rescinding all kinds of executive actions. I mean, that had been implemented by the Clinton administration. I think that's part of just how we govern now. One of the reasons it's why we govern now is because so much of what we do is by executive order rather than by law. I think that is one illness of our system. There are a lot of things which should be taken care of by law and not by executive order. And both presidents of both parties have gone in the direction of executive order, and Congress has let them do it. That's a separate rant, but I think that's true. I think it would be entirely appropriate for Biden to explicitly repudiate much, though not all, of Trump foreign policy. Usually I wouldn't say that, because usually you want people to understand that there's a lot of continuity in American foreign policy. And in fact, there's a lot more than people think. So, it's not a great idea for the, George W. Bush people come in and say everything that the Clinton people did was stupid and we're not going to do it anymore. It wasn't a great thing for the Obama people to come in and say everything that George W. Bush did was stupid and we're not going to do it anymore, and so on. But in this case, I would make an exception. I would not pull back from the China policy, saying, things like going after Huawei. I do think the most important thing is being very deliberate, and this will be easy to do, about just setting a different tone about how you speak with allies, what your view of alliances is, what your view of the American role in the world is, what your view of American values is. And there, I think it's entirely appropriate to draw some really sharp contrasts. And I think the basic message will be, we got a little bit crazy here, but the old America is back. And I think that would be very reassuring to people.
So this is a question from Alex Hoffman. How can we keep, not should we, but how can we keep human rights centered in our future interactions with China? Yes, should we as well? But I think the answer, I know your answer, should we, is probably yes. But the answer is always in the execution, which is how can we do it?
So I mean, the first thing to say is, our China policy is not a subset of our human rights policy. Our human rights it's human rights that's the subset of the China policy, not the other way around. It's not the only aspect of our relationship. There's a strategic relationship, there's a commercial relationship, and we really need to find a way to balance all those things. I think the first most important thing is you don't shut up. You don't censor yourself. You don't let yourself be intimidated, and you certainly don't let your citizens be intimidated. Secondly, so simply speaking up makes a difference. There are a lot of dissidents and prisoners in this world who would have been dead if there hadn't been an American president or secretary of state speaking up on their behalf and saying, listen, we're paying attention, and we care about what happens to this particular individual. I think secondly, where you can do things, you should. And for me, the no-brainer in all this, which the Canadians figured out long ago, and I don't know why we haven't, is, say with Hong Kong, okay, we're not going to invade Hong Kong to restore democratic governance, but what you can do is you can bring in lots of those smart, liberty-loving Hong Kongers and give them passports and help them on a path to American citizenship, and make it clear that, those words in the Statue of Liberty still have some meaning. And so I would definitely do that, and I think finally, there are things that we should be able to do in terms of things in the sort of the VOA kind of things that make sure that you get information to people as much as you possibly can. But it's going to be a complicated relationship, and it can't all be about human rights, but it can't exclude human rights either.
How do you, just to follow up on that, and this is where I feel like we're at a fundamental different place vis-a-vis the Chinese government that we were with the Soviet Union, is that we have the American business community in many ways that has a role because they have a vested interest in what goes on in China in a way that they, let's say, didn't with the Soviet Union. So the controversy over the MBA, for example, last fall, the controversy over American businesses that might be doing business in things that are enabling Chinese actions against the Uyghurs or in Hong Kong or Taiwan, et cetera. SAIS itself, right? SAIS has had a campus in China for a number of decades, right? So there's a lot of, I don't quite want to say interdependency, because I'm not sure it's necessarily that, but there are a lot of interwoven relationships where there's a new actor on the scene. How do you feel like we should handle those things? What message do you have internally with SAIS at your campus vis-a-vis American businesses or social media platforms in terms of how they are working with, I don't necessarily want to use the word collaborating because that has a certain connotation, but how do they maintain the exact same things that Alex asked, but at the same time, still want to advance, natural business and exchange of ideas and commerce?
Let's talk about it as a team. So, I've expressed my views about American foreign policy pretty clearly. And, I'm sure those are not the views that the Communist Party would really prefer that I express. Secondly, you draw distinctions about who you're dealing with. And in particular, you draw the distinctions between the people of a country and its government, and between different parts of that government and different institutions that you're working with. And thirdly, you know what your own principles are. For us, the principle with HNC has always been academic freedom. And I think the Chinese side has always known that if academic freedom was really, if we believe that it was being in some serious way infringed upon, we wouldn't sustain the relationship. And we've been very explicit. We've been very explicit about that. You know, there are always going to be boundary cases that you end up dealing with because very few things in life are ever really completely black and white. But you know, that's not a bad model. In terms of businesses, at the end of the day, businesses do tend to defer to governments. And, you know, look, I'm sure there are a lot of American businesses that really would like to be able to use Huawei kit. But if the US government says, if you do that, you're not doing any business with the United States government, they'll go along with it because that's what they do. I mean, businesses need governments. Ultimately, I tend to believe businesses need government more than the other way around. And, you know, I think even for countries that are a lot smaller than the United States, that seems to be the case. And then finally, I think business in China has I think American business people now have a more complicated view. That's in particular as concerns about things like intellectual property rights and so on have taken off. And so I just think empirically, the American business community is not quite where it was on relations with China as opposed to the past. I mean, in the past, there was really a very, very strong reflex that said, don't say anything bad about China. And I don't think, you know, when as we've said appropriately, some pretty tough things about Hong Kong, I don't really detect a whole lot of American business standing up and saying, no, the Chinese are doing exactly the right thing. The Chinese government is doing the right thing. And like I said, I really think it's critically important to distinguish two things. It's critically important to distinguish between a government and a particular piece of that government at a particular time and the rest of the societies, the rest of the society and the institutions that you end up dealing with on a daily basis. And I do think you have to be willing to be true to your own ideals. Because you'll end up paying a terrible price in the long run if you don't.
So I think last question on our end, and it's a question from Alan Bird, which is, do you believe there is an anti-American sentiment in our schools or higher educational institutions? If there is, how do today's patriotic students reconcile that?
I wouldn't call it anti-American. You know, it's the American experience is extraordinarily diverse, and Americans have had all kinds of different views. And the voices shouting Black Lives Matter are distinctly American voices, and the voices of white supremacists are distinctly American voices. I mean, this is, you know, Walt Whitman said, I contain multitudes, and for better and for worse. And there's some very dark parts of the American past which are authentic. I mean, slavery was authentically American. The genocide of a lot of Native Americans was distinctively American, but, you know, Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King are distinctively American, and to my mind, in an even greater measure. You know, the most important thing that we need to get people used to is the idea that this country, like every other country, has a complicated past with some extraordinarily bright and inspiring things and some dark and terrible things. And that's a mature way of approaching it. What I do think is critical is the ability to affirm our ideals as embodied in things like the Declaration of Independence and the Second Inaugural, and to understand that, you know, just because Jefferson, for example, was a slaveholder and a hypocrite, doesn't mean that those ideals are any the less valuable, and far from it. And they are aspirational, the things that we point ourselves to. And the second thing is, it is important, I believe, to have heroes, even if we know that those heroes are themselves flawed. So, you know, am I temperamentally inclined to think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's domestic programs were great? And probably not, because I'm basically a limited government kind of guy. Do I think he was a great man? Absolutely. And can I admire him? Absolutely. You know, and if you go throughout American history, there are lots of wonderfully positive examples that you can turn to. And I think the challenge for all of us is to engage, and not, maybe that's the way we should end. It's not to walk away from a discussion or a debate. It's not to write off an entire array of institutions. It's not to write off, you know, a group of people who hold a set of political beliefs that one disagrees with. You know, that's not going to get us anywhere. It is to engage in thoughtful civil discourse and to affirm the need for that. I'm writing an article right now about this letter in Harper's, signed, I think, by over 150 intellectuals, including some people I really don't agree with at all, like Noam Chomsky, who say, look, you know, free debate and discourse is the lifeblood of liberal democracy, and that's under assault from the right, but we think it's also under assault from the left. That's an incredibly, I mean, to me it's obvious, but it's also bold and somewhat courageous, and good for them for saying it. And I think that just, you know, my message, I suppose, to members of the society is don't walk away from that struggle, and don't write other people off, and don't be afraid to get into the thick of it. And I'm not saying that you might not get hurt, because you may, but the real American way is, you know, not to take that, is not to walk away, but to engage.
Well, thank you for engaging with us. Thank you for taking the time today. Good luck, obviously, leading an institution where social distancing is very hard, but necessary in many ways. But I hope that social distancing doesn't lead to intellectual distancing, which I think is a problem that would be much harder to get out of. So thanks so much for joining us. And just a quick public service announcement. We have another event tomorrow, a book talk with Professor Matt Kroenig of Georgetown on his new book about how democracies, in his opinion, are better suited for competition than autocracies are. And we have an event early next week, next Monday, I believe, on the strategic endgame with China, discussion with Aaron Friedberg, who's a professor of politics at Princeton, and Bridge Colby, who in many ways wrote the National Defense Strategy while serving in the Trump administration. So hopefully it's a healthy discussion about what America's China policy ought to be. So with that, hope everybody's doing well, and see you soon. And Eliot, thank you again.
Yeah, my pleasure. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.